think. Hello, everybody. My name is Eliza Woolison. This is panel 5715, Sustainable Development is Not a Pipe Dream. I'm going to be introducing our four panelists first, and then each of them will speak for about 8 minutes. And when they get to 8 minutes, they're going to be past the New York Times. So it's not like I'm telling them to shut up. It's just like I'm just passing this as a kind reminder. So just as a brief introduction to these four really amazing panelists, I don't know if any of you have been to hear them this week, but they've been on some of, in my opinion, some of the best panels of the week. So here we are on the last day. You're probably all very excited or really rejuvenated. So our first panelist is Michael Elliott. He's the president and CEO of One. He recently, he disclosed to me that he's read When Breath Becomes Air 2 times, and he still doesn't get it, so nobody is allowed to ask him anything about that book. Our second panelist is Andre Edwards. He's a sustainability consultant and founder and president of EduTracks. His daughter also goes to CU. She's studying sociology. I don't think she's in the psychology. She's not in the audience. No.
No, she's watching Joe Biden right
Biden
now. But she's been
won out.
To previous
of her own father.
Many other of my panels.
How dare she, right? And our third panelist is Gregory Bowles. He works for Solar Women of Nicaragua. Tomorrow is his father's 75th birthday. He lives in Boulder, and he works at Naropa, and we love our fathers. And the fourth panelist is a woman by the name of Judith Morrison. She's a senior advisor in the Gender and Diversity Division of the Inter-American Development Bank. I have known Judith for now since her child was in utero. So for the first year I met her, I was the moderator for her panel, and she was very, very pregnant. That was not the year that she's missed. She's been at the Conference of World Affairs for the last 14 years, and it wasn't when she was huge and pregnant. So she's a big diehard Conference of World Affairs, as we all are. So thank you all again for coming. I know that a couple of you know that this week we've been trying a new process at Conference of World Affairs. It is to allow the questions to be asked a little easier. And we're asking everybody to text in any question to this code. If they don't feel comfortable texting, then there'll be somebody around handing out cards, our friend back here, handing out 3x5 cards. You can write the question that you have on the 3x5 card. She'll pick it up, bring it up to me, and I'll ask the question. So, Michael, would you like to begin?
So for those of you who were here at the last session in this room, I don't know, were any of you here for the last session in this room? So why do I always get picked on to go first? You know, and just as a test to see how many of you were paying attention, what does this mean in HTML code? Any of you remember? End poverty. Thank you very much. Thank you. I've got some One members sitting 5 rows back there. Great to see you. What's the title? Is Sustainable Development a Pipe Dream? It better not be, right? Because we're all done for if it is. It's a fabulous topic to have on the last day of the Conference on World Affairs, and I should say, you know, by way of introduction, how great it is to be with this terrific panel, and just how great it is to be back in Boulder. I've been coming to the conference now for, I think, 30 years. I can't quite remember whether it was 1986 or 1987. Not every year, I should say, and I very rarely can kind of come for the whole week. I just kind of, the deal is I kind of come into town for a couple of days, and I say to the organizers, just squeeze me into as many panels as you like, just in a couple of days, and you can work me around the clock. But it's always great to be here. It's great to see old friends. It's great to be on terrific panels like this. I cannot stand this room. It just sort of, there's something about this room that is soulless and dead, and these lights that are glaring at us right now. It's sort of, a Hollywood set without any of the sex appeal. So it's sort of, anyway, it's a terrific title to have. It's a terrific topic to have on the last afternoon of the conference, because it really goes to the future of our world, the future of our planet. Is sustainable development a pipe dream? Can we have development at the same time as sustainability? At the last session that was in this room, I was talking about how we are on the path, if we get everything right over the next 15 years, to eradicate extreme poverty, to move from a world where something like 13% of the population of the world still lives in extreme poverty, with less than $1.90 a day in income, to where no one does. We've seen amazing, really extraordinary things happen to our world in the last 30 years. I wrote a long article last year, which I'm trying to turn into a book, called The Age of Miracles, simply because we've seen poverty reduce so fast, we've seen childhood deaths reduce so fast, we've seen infectious diseases reduce so fast. There are certain things we haven't seen that we should have seen in terms of improvement of life chances. We haven't seen maternal mortality shrink as fast as it has, but we've seen some extraordinary things happen in the last 30 years. But there is a but, right? As more people become relatively prosperous, as more people have more potential in their life chances, as the population continues to grow in a finite planet which has boundaries. So the development, which is what my organization, the Lobbying and Campaigning Organization on Extreme Poverty and Preventable Disease, exists for, the development that I champion, potentially rubs up against constraints of sustainability, of boundaries, of limits, both in terms of natural resources, in terms of space, and in terms of livability. So we need to be able to kind of get things right. Last year, at the United Nations, in September last year, the nations of the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, 17 of them. My great friend Richard Curtis and his colleagues designed, you can probably see this kind of beautiful tablet of all 17 goals in kind of nice primary colors. And the goals try and get to the twin objectives of development and sustainability. Goal 1, no poverty. Goal 2, zero hunger. 3, good health and well-being. 4, quality education. 5, gender equality. 6, clean water and sanitation. 7, affordable and clean energy. 8, decent work and economic growth. 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure. 10, reduced inequalities, very important. 11, sustainable cities and communities. 12, responsible consumption and production. 13, action on climate. 14, life below water. I thought that was a little cute, actually. 15, life on land, the water, land thing. 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and 17 partnerships. So the goals that were adopted by the UN were an attempt to kind of put together sustainability and development in a way that we could, that would enable us to form an agenda, an action agenda in the next 15 years. And each country put together plans that got us towards true sustainable development. So both development and in a context that we did not wreck our planetary boundaries, that we did not wreck our natural environment, that we did not wreck our ecosystems, that we did not wreck our land and wreck our water. Promises, though, mean nothing unless they're kept. Teenage boys make promises all the time to teenage girls. They're rarely kept, right? I mean, all of us make promises. Promises and 25 cents will get you a phone call. What really counts about making promises, and this is where our student members of the One Campaign sitting in the audience over there come in, what really counts about making promises is making sure that they're kept, is making sure that leaders, political leaders, who make promises about development, who make promises about sustainability, make promises about climate change, make promises about gender equality, make promises about reducing inequalities, make promises about sustainable communities, that we hold their feet to the fire to make sure that those promises are kept, because a promise made counts for nothing. The only thing that matters in this world is a promise kept. So that's why the key part of the next 15 years, when we will try and demonstrate that sustainable development is not a pipe dream, is not wonderful promises that people make. It is people like you, it's millennials, it's students, it's soccer moms, it's pastors, it's ministers, it's rabbis, it's communities of faith all over the world, watching those who are placed in positions of authority over us to make sure that when they promise us a better world, they damn well mean it, and if they don't, they will pay a price. And that's how we will make sure that sustainable development is not a pipe dream.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. It's been an amazing week. It's my first year here, and it's funny, I first came to this conference as a student and really enjoyed it. And it's been a terrific opportunity to be part of such great panelists. Much of my work has to do with the big picture sustainability movement, looking at from way back in terms of the whole evolution of that. But this afternoon I want to focus on a very specific event that I was privileged to be a part of, and that is that a couple of months ago I was invited to be part of a kayaking expedition in the south of Chile, in Patagonia. And I had an opportunity to go with 4 other people to go on a sea kayaking expedition. We were working with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and part of the work was to document the changes that have taken place in this very specific region west of Puerto Natales called Canal de las Montañas. We started out in the park, Torres del Paine, kayaked down the Rio Serrano, and then went to Lago Azul, and then went back to Natales, and then for 2 weeks, the whole thing took 3.5 weeks. For 2 weeks, we went west to this fjord called Canal de las Montañas, and to give you a sense of it, it's about 30 miles long, it's 1/4 mile wide. You have peaks that rise 5,000 to 7,000 feet, with hanging glaciers, tidewater glaciers, sea lions, dolphins, condors, imperial cormorants, Magellanic oyster catchers, all kinds of bird life. And it was very difficult to get to, so we got the sense that very few people had a chance to go there. Don Whedon, who organized this trip, had been there 40 years ago, 1976. And he had also been there 30 years ago, but he hadn't really reached the very end of this place because it takes so long to get there. And so we eventually got to the very end. We noticed, according to Don, who had been there, that many of the glaciers had receded quite a bit. But aside from that, now there was also a summer tour of a tour boat that couldn't get to the end because the very end is very, very shallow, and the charts don't even give you the depth. It was maybe 6 or 8 feet with the tide when we got to the very end, so it was only by kayak or small dinghy that you could get there. And we did see an oyster operation, mussel operation there that was just seasonal. So probably the greatest change that did take place in that area was Puerto Natales. When Don had been there 40 years ago, there was maybe one house and maybe one hotel. And in Torres del Paine National Park, there was also one hotel. Now there are dozens of them, and they're all in this one big basin, many of them, and there's no really architectural guidelines for it, so it looks like a big mishmash. And it's unfortunate because rather than build 1 or 2 big lodges, they ended up building all of this area. The tourism in the park has dramatically increased. They get about 200,000 visitors right now, and the infrastructure is not like Yosemite. You get a place like Smoky Mountain National Park, they get, I believe it's 10 million visitors. Yosemite gets about 4 million, Yellowstone close to that. But for that area, it's a huge boom, and it's growing. Puerto Natales now has dozens of hotels and dozens of trekking. Don said it reminded him of Tamel, which is a section of Kathmandu, which is often like a jumping off point for people trekking in the Himalayas. So that's been like a major shift. the ecotourism has been a big shift. The other thing that is really impacting that whole area is salmon fish farms. That is a huge industry and business. It's started in Puerto Montt, which is several hundred miles north of there. And we had a chance to, when we started going to the canal, we met some fishermen there. And there were several operations, and most of them are foreign owned. And they have these pens that may have 100,000 fish. And the job of the fishermen is to wear the scuba gear with these really big suction devices, almost like a big underwater vacuum cleaner. And they suck out about 200 fish or more each day because of death. And I'm not an expert in salmon farming, but I know that much of the controversy, the first big one is that it takes 2.5 to 5 kilograms of feed, which is fish feed, to get 1 kilogram of farm fish. So the economics already doesn't make sense in that. And much of these fish are fished out of areas where villages actually need them. There's also all kinds of diseases that go with that. There's all kinds of waste that go with that. But in Chile, it happens to be an area where it's ideal conditions because you have the ideal water temperature, about 40 degrees, and these protected fjords. There's places in Norway and British Columbia where it happens, but they're moving a lot of the operations to land where they have tanks as well. So that's been a huge shift, and it threatens the fjord that we were in. There's nothing going on there now, but part of the challenge is that many of the regulations are more lax and not as strict as they are in the first world, or at least in the northern hemisphere. The other thing I want to say, which is really relevant, is Elliot here in the audience? Elliot Higgins? There he is. Elliot was on this trip, and he was one of the 5 of us that was there. I also want to mention the work of Doug Tompkins in that whole region of Patagonia. I don't know if any of you, most of you maybe have heard of him. He was the founder of the North Face and Esprit, and he and his wife Chris were, for the last 25 years, have been working in this area to protect the land, to set up national parks. Because they bought all this land and they've donated much of it now, and the objective is to donate all of it back to Chile and in Argentina. They've been working in both countries to devote it back, and he's done a tremendous, incredible work to do this work. A very, very unfortunate, tragic kayaking accident happened last December where he died from hypothermia while kayaking in a lake in the south of Chile. But his legacy is phenomenal. Chile actually made him an honorary citizen after his death. And he had first gone down there in the 60s and then was there later and fell in love with the place, and he and Chris have been working for decades to protect this area. And it brings to mind the importance of preserving these wild places that are very, very remote. And we can think of places like Alaska or Canada or Patagonia. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of islands down there that maybe nobody's been to or very few people have been to. And the question that comes up is, what is the value for the earth to have these places protected, even though most people will never get there? So why should we, and what is the value of protecting, of having the biodiversity of these regions there? And their parks, Pumalin Park, Patagonia National Park, which just opened, and they're doing studies in terms of the puma and the guanaco and the huemul, which is an Andean deer that is endangered as well. So all of this work is critical, but they've also had to transform the land. Much of the land down there became estancias for sheep farming and cattle. They also had a lot of trouble with fires. Tom Veblen, who's a professor here, I was a geography major, he's done a lot of work there in terms of fire ecology and all of that. And a lot of the work also involved taking down fences so that the wildlife could migrate and go back and forth. And so how to save wild places, the value of saving wild places, how to make sure that impacts such as salmon fish farming, how do we regulate that? How do we make sure that it doesn't get out of control and control the damage? And that's not just in Chile, but in other places. And the benefits of ecotourism, and how do we manage that? Because they're not at the level of Yosemite where you have to start taking a bus to go to the valley when it's that crowded, but it definitely is is increasing and increasing and increasing, and how do we protect that? One of the challenges there is that they basically have very few trails. Is the U and the W trail that go around the famous peaks, and the campground gets pretty filled up pretty quickly. So this experience for me, and having been born in Chile and going back, was really powerful as a way, because I had been there 30 years ago, and had been to the park when there was one hotel, and to see the whole growth in the last 30 years, having not been back there since then, really was a wake-up call of how quickly development happens, and then what the threats are, and then how to figure out the value of these wild places, and how do we set aside this land. And Doug and Chris will continue this work, and I'm so happy that they're so committed, and her team are committed to doing this work. But I think it's very, very valuable to protect these areas, because they're still pristine. Elliot and I, when we were in the kayak boats, the water is actually, I remember reading a report before I left that the purest water on the planet, it was in Puerto Williams area, which is south of there. When we were up in there, we would choose campgrounds. The water would come off the streams or off the glaciers. We never had to treat it. We could just drink it right off. We'd be up by these cliffs on the boats, and we'd just fill up like you fill up at the gas station. Put the water bottle next to the waterfall, fill it up, drink it. Unbelievable. And then food for mussels, we would just, take what was there in every beach and area. So it was such an awakening for me, having done a lot of hiking and being in the wilderness here in Colorado and in California, where you have to worry about all these things, and also feeling like maybe there's no trails. You just figure out where you want to go, and just the value of being there, and biodiversity, and what that is for the planet, and how to preserve that. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Now Gregory Bowles will speak.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to what I think will probably be, if not the final, one of the final sessions of the Conference on World Affairs. I believe there are a few evening events, but as far as panels, this is probably one of the last ones, and I've certainly been to some amazing ones, including the one that was just prior to this one here in this room on the subject of tackling global poverty, which is an issue that relates to sustainability in quite a few ways as well. Michael went first on that panel as well, and right before we entered the room, there was some debate about who was going to go first, who was going to go second on this panel. And I don't think Michael was too happy about being put first on the panel, but one of the reasons that some of us who had seen him speak, why we wanted him to go first, is because he does address very well the issue of poverty, global poverty, and sustainability from a large-scale perspective, from the level of the macro level, so to speak, of how you deal with issues such as that. My own background and what I will speak to is at the small scale level, at the level at which I work now. Just a brief little bit about my background. I started out as a Peace Corps volunteer, actually as a VISTA volunteer in rural Alaska before working as Peace Corps volunteer in Mongolia and Bangladesh. But in the last 16 years, most of my life and my work has centered around working in or being in Central America, more specifically Nicaragua, though I've worked in Honduras, Panama, and Belize. And for the purposes of this topic, sustainable development, whether or not it's a pipe dream, I think the best role that I can take is in some ways channeling my wife, who's sitting right over there, who was a panelist on the last panel, the last discussion that was held in this room. What my wife does, and I work with her on this, is she runs a small nonprofit that works with women in rural areas of Nicaragua, building solar ovens, solar food dryers, and teaching women and men, but mostly women, how to do small-scale sustainable agriculture. We are also both on the board for Boulder for Friendship City Projects, which is the longest-serving sister city program between the city of Boulder and another country, in this case between Boulder and the city of Jalapa in northern Nicaragua. And my work with them is mostly focused upon, is mostly focused on potable water projects, working together with communities. Her work with rural women and the work with communities in potable water, to me, relate to sustainability on a small scale or a micro level, specifically in how you engage the people of the communities that we work with in this kind of thing. And for me, that's a crucial component of sustainability. The goals that Michael outlined when he was speaking about the UN goals for sustainability and some of these other goals that are big picture kind of things are crucial, are utterly important to the issues of sustainable development, to the issues of tackling global poverty. But at some point that has to be translated down to working with the actual targets of efforts to do sustainable development, to tackle global poverty. You have to be able to reach out to the people that you want to get out of that get out from under those circumstances, whether that means getting out from under in economic terms of becoming less poor, or whether it means having better access to health care, better access to human rights, not being oppressed either by their own governments or oppressed within their own families. I mean, I think Judith will be speaking to some of those issues when she speaks about some. I'm not sure if she's going to be speaking about women's issues in those regards, which are vital to discuss. But again, channeling my wife and talking a little bit about what we do with the solar ovens, solar food dryers, and sustainable agriculture program. The way that we work, and what I feel is very important for this type of sustainable development, is to have people buy into what that work is. And so it's not just something imposed from outside. It's not something we say, this is good for you and you must do it. It's something that they come to believe in. One of the important ways, for example, that my wife's program in particular does its job is that when we're building these solar ovens, the women themselves have to participate in building the solar ovens, and most of them are rural Nicaraguan women who have never been given an opportunity before to even touch tools, because that's a man's job, and they've never before been offered any education or any training in how to use tools or build something. So the idea is not just you get a solar oven, the idea is also that you learn how to build a solar oven from the ground up, and as a part of that you're learning skills such as how to use tools, how to use a power drill, how to measure, how to cut, all of these types of things. And as my wife brought up in the last session, you kind of have a captive audience, since you could build one of these ovens in a day if you wanted, but they hold courses or workshops on building these solar ovens over the course of 10 days. And during those 10 days, since they have a captive audience, you work physically building the ovens for a few hours a day, and then you can talk about other topics. It's a free space to discuss not just issues like nutrition that may relate to the solar ovens. It's also a space in which to discuss things that affect them in their day-to-day lives, whether that be domestic violence, whether that be child care, whatever the case may be. And that type of thing, to me, relates to sustainability, because you're opening a window, a door for people who have never really had the opportunity that we have here, for example, to participate in panels such as this. Where we work, where my wife's program works, is in very rural, isolated areas of Nicaragua. Quite often, many of the women that we work with, they've never had an opportunity in their life to even make it past high school, much less be able to participate in conferences such as this. So giving them that kind of an opportunity through something as simple as building a solar oven or a solar food dryer is vital, is crucial in order to implement the sustainability goals that we all have some knowledge of, perhaps in this room, but which has never been discussed in places like Pacaya, Nicaragua, or in Jalapa, Nicaragua. So building that into the program that you're working on, the overall, the big picture goals that you may have for sustainability are, to me, crucial. And I think that's something that we always try to keep in the back of our minds in the work that we do, whether it be work with the solar ovens and food dryers, with the sustainable agriculture work that we do, or the potable water projects that I work on up in Jalapa, Nicaragua, through the Sister City program between Boulder and Nicaragua. A part of that, too, again, is having some investment, not just in the physical side of it or the work of doing it, but having the community decide that this is something important, that it matters to them to have a solar oven. Of course, in most communities, it matters to them to have good, clean drinking water. But to give an example, with the potable water projects that we work on in Jalapa, most of the community the community itself has to contribute. the labor for that. I mean, there is some paid labor, a construction foreman, some engineers who work together with our organization to build these potable water systems. But each family in the community has to contribute anywhere from 20 to 40 days of free labor to build a water system. That could be digging ditches, that could be hauling cement, whatever it may be. But it's not just here's your free gift of clean water. People deserve that, and actually I would believe that everybody does deserve free water, does deserve clean water for free. But in this particular case, in order to build these water systems, we're not just saying, hey, we'll come in and do it for you. The community has to contribute, and that's really never been an issue. I mean, it goes the other way. We often have people do more than their fair share of work on these types of projects. If someone's not able to do physical labor, they contribute in other ways. For example, if they're physically handicapped, or if they just too old to haul up the mountains and carry a 100-pound bag of cement on their heads, then they may fix food for the workers that are doing that kind of work. So people contribute in all kinds of ways, but the point is that no one is given anything for free, and that, to me, relates to sustainability as well, because people really value it when they put something into it. Going back to the solar ovens, women really value those solar ovens when they themselves have built them. And also they do pay a small fee to receive their solar ovens. The solar ovens cost about $200 for materials. Each woman pays $35 as well as build their own solar oven. The $35 is usually paid over time. 2 years, I believe, is the repayment time. So it's not like they have to come, these are people that make $2 to $3 a day. It's not like they have to come up with $35 to receive their solar oven. They essentially take out a loan in order to receive it. But again, those kinds of things are on a small scale level what I think you have to consider in terms of sustainability as well. I'll stop there. The newspaper's been passed to me. No, it's a good thing. We actually do, part of being sustainable is giving other people a voice as well, and we want to give all of you a chance to answer questions, so I don't want to keep rambling away too long, and so passing the newspaper is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But once again, I really have appreciated all of the panels, and I appreciate your presence here for this final panel, and with that, I think I'll end my words and pass it on to Judith.
Thank you. And our last panelist is Judith Morrison.
First of all, it's truly a pleasure to be here. This is my last panel on the last day. It's always bittersweet. This conference is always extremely invigorating. As some of you may know, I take vacation time to come out here. I come here on my own time and my own dime. It means that I'm also here. My views do not represent the views of the Inter-American Development Bank or the Board of Governors or the member countries. They only represent my point of view. One of the things that I wanted to start out discussing, and I've been working in sustainable development for more than 20 years now, and one of the things that I find fascinating about sustainable development is if I get an invitation for a conference or an event on sustainable development, I really have no idea what it might be about. Just to give you an example, sometimes it's about people-centered development. Right in the beginning of my career, sustainable development often was a term used for grassroots development, community-centered development. Sometimes now, because I do some work on biodiversity and look at issues of conservation, it might be fully engaged in biodiversity, kind of seeing people as the problem, and not having any relationship at all to people and individuals and how people interact with biodiversity or conservation or the natural environment. And that's usually when you hear about sustainable development being specifically environmentally sustainable development. But I wanted to talk to you about a very specific type of sustainable development that's really taking root in Latin America and is becoming timidly part of the policy discourse. And this is the sustainable development that's development with identity, or buen vivir, or sumac causai. Have any of you heard the term buen vivir before? If you have, can you raise your hand? Okay, I see buen vivir. Okay, I see one or two hands, including someone, I think, back there in the tech area. Way to go. Only in Boulder can you find the tech folks are way up to date on development language, which is wonderful. Basically what buen vivir means, and sumac, it comes from the Quechua. It means fullness, holistic, or beautiful. And causai means life. So it's the beautiful life, it's the balanced life, it's coexistence and diversity and harmony with nature. It's this notion that to live well, you have to be in harmony. And what's been fascinating about this movement is that at least two countries in the region, Ecuador in 2008 and Bolivia in 2009, actually incorporated these concepts into their constitution. So it's part of their development framework. They're indigenous frameworks, and they're indigenous frameworks that, for example, Semplades, the planning office of Ecuador, actually has to quantify and come up with indicators for how to measure this notion of living well, or buen vivir. Sometimes people also say vivir bien, but it's usually buen vivir or suma causai. What's fascinating about this is that we know that there's something about not being in harmony with the environment that's intrinsically complicated and problematic. And I think one of the challenges, particularly when we think about development more generally, is that our horizons are very short. We make decisions, you hear about a lot of the traditional cultures look at 7 generations. We're making decisions really not even for the next 10 or 15 years because we're looking for very quick returns on investment. How we monetize, how we quantify, how we understand development is with such a short-term time horizon that some of those, really negative externalities are not being incorporated into our development models in terms of how we're thinking about things. You add electoral cycles, policy complications that people are kind of constantly trying to get elected, constantly trying to show results in the very short term, and you end up with policies that may not be sustainable. And this notion of kind of going back and looking more long-term, looking more at harmonious relationships with the environment, that if the environment isn't doing well, then somehow we're not doing well. And I think Andres kind of alluded to this, that to think that, going camping in a developed country, you don't have access to that pristine water that you can access in a place like Chile where that's been given a value, and that has an intrinsic value for many of us. For tourists, we see it consistently, this looking for an authentic experience, an experience that can't be found in other places, an experience that means a lot. And I think one of the challenges right now, when I am talking with indigenous leaders, and particularly indigenous leaders from Latin America, many of them are grappling with how do they do planning and how do they think about development using this notion of buen vivir, or development with identity, development with some sort of cultural identity, with some sort of cultural value. I think the traditional, and I will talk a little bit about the traditional, but we have to understand that native cultures and, in Latin America, indigenous peoples are living peoples. And so we're seeing increasingly a younger generation that's becoming more technocratic, that wants to retain a connection with their traditional lands, with their traditional peoples, but they may be in London, like the young statistician that I met, who's actually studying at Oxford and studying in order to benefit his community. Now, they've created a buen vivir plan within his community. They're located not too far from Cali, Colombia. And this plan they wanted to use some of the most sophisticated data analysis tools available. And what was their limitation? The satellite imaging, each satellite image for them would cost at least $1,000. They started to explore the idea of looking at drones because they couldn't even really map their territories, and they felt that people were starting to encroach and that they had to have an aerial view of what was happening with the environment to be able to assess how they were living, because the environment for them was a litmus test or an indicator for health and well-being of the community. What did they do? They ended up purchasing toy helicopters at a very low price, $25 at the most, and put cameras on these toy helicopters and did aerial surveillance maps of their community. And they now do that, several times a year to assess how are the flora and fauna doing, where are there areas where there may be too many people concentrated in one part of the community where they may need to spread out a little bit more, densify, in order to better use the natural resources. So again, they're using sophisticated technical tools and adapted technical tools. They also use all freeware to analyze these maps and data. So they kind of process it all in their computers, and they have just as much information as any government agency might have about their local community. And they use this information then to create these longer-term plans, and these longer-term plans that they share with the leadership and that are used in consensus with others within the community to make decisions. Now, what I also think is very fascinating and also very wonderful about the process is that for them it's a tool for them, by them, that they themselves are controlling. So this is not something that's publicly available to just anyone, but it's publicly available to all of them within the community, and it's widely shared. The other example that I want to give to you is an example that's more traditional. And I'm just reflecting on a wonderful discussion that we had with our housers yesterday evening, and an amazing dancer, Rulan, who maybe some of you have seen, who captures a lot of the traditional dance. And when we think about traditional knowledge, how is that knowledge passed on? Often it's through poetry, it's through dance, it's through stories, it's through song. And I think in development spaces, we really want to understand evidence, and we want the evidence, we want the hard data. And a lot of this evidence actually, I think, can be found in some of these traditional expressions because they're based on observations, and the way they're passing on the observation is through traditional forms of expression and through tradition or oral tradition. And to give you a very clear example, and something that you yourself can kind of look up and follow along on, I'm remembering, this was almost 2 years ago, a group called the Kogi from the Sierra Nevada in Colombia, who in 1990 were involved in a film project with BBC that was, actually got quite a bit of attention. And they were seeing the effects, they live way up in the mountains, and they were basically seeing the effects of climate change. They were seeing that certain types of foliage was dying out. They were noticing that there was less biodiversity. Animals were going down lower in the mountain, or were no longer surviving where they had traditionally survived. And in the Kogi tradition, they see themselves as being the big brother because they're way up high, and we're the little brothers and sisters. And they wanted to come down from the mountain to tell the little brothers and sisters that, hey, what you guys are doing is really having an impact up there on the mountain. And so they did that, and a film crew came with them, and they filmed this beautiful documentary that's still actually quite popular. It's over 20 years old. And they were so concerned that just a few years ago they did this experiment again, or had this experience again. It's documented in a film called Aluna. And in Aluna, they go along the coast and they take a thread and they show what's happening in all of the coastal areas, because although they live way up in the mountains, they get a lot of their sacred and spiritual products from the coastlines. And so when they go down, it's harder and harder for them to find things that they need for their rituals up on the mountain. And they tell this story. And there's a wonderful part of the film where the traditional leader, and what they do is they spend a lot of time, particularly people who have been identified with leadership skills and skills of observation, being in the darkness. And when they're in the darkness, they can see the constellations and they can kind of learn and vision what's happening with the environment. And there's this wonderful interaction, and I'll close on this note. The wonderful interaction in a planetarium with an astronomer and a very traditional elder, and they are identifying meteors, and the elder knows exactly what's happening with the positioning, and they're both experts. And it's very clear that what's been learned traditionally through observation is just as valid, and perhaps even more valid, than what's been observed in this planetarium and the telescope for decades as well by this other astronomer. And you're hearing these guys really talking as peers. So it shows you how, we have to sometimes think about how we share evidence. We have to think about how evidence is used. And I think really valuing some of this more traditional is going to be key to our sustainability. As someone who's very concerned about climate change and the rapid pace of environmental degradation that we're experiencing right now with the melting of the glaciers and rapid fluctuations of our climate, I think these traditional wisdom and traditional ways of knowing may be part of the key actually to our survival as humanity. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about sustainability. I think we have a diverse number of perspectives on sustainability here on the panel. And I think, increasingly we have to think about what does this mean for our lives and how we can make a contribution to really making the world much more sustainable in the many myriad ways that we can do that. Thank you.
For the next couple minutes, I'm going to have the panelists respond to each other. And at this time, if you could text in your questions, this is the text number. And then you want to put in UMC 235 in the subject, and then press enter. And then it'll say you're on, and then you ask the question. Anybody who doesn't feel comfortable doing that and they'd rather just fill out a 3x5 card, that's fine too. They're right back here. There's somebody up here that wants one. It's coming. Did anybody would anybody like to respond to anybody in their comments?
I just one of the things that I was thinking about before this panel is I think also how we live our lives in a sustainable way is often just good to do some of that reflection. Like I'm always amazed when I come to Boulder and realize just how much you kind of have to drive out here. And I think I'm also kind of channeling or thinking about some of the discussion that came up that Michael mentioned about the GMOs, and we can't find as much GMO. I mean, we most of our food in Washington is GMO for the most part, and we don't have a lot of designated standalone places to find non-GMO products. So it's very interesting how even region and place within the United States is driving the discussion on sustainability. Whereas for us it's all about transit, walking, biking, public transit. Here it's about GMO. So it's always good to get out of your perspective and see if there are ways that you yourself can become more sustainable or kind of push the debate in different spaces and places. So I appreciate all of you Boulderites kind of educating me and informing me on some of these issues as well.
I'd like to add one observation that I've noticed over the years, and that is that when we talk about sustainability and sustainable development, these are such broad global statistics and principles and all of this that it makes it very ethereal and very difficult to connect to. So I think one of the things that's great about what I've heard in this panel is that the way to ground it is through stories. The way to ground it is through experiences. And it's so difficult, especially with young people or even us, older folks, thinking about how do I make an impact? How do I get into this? Well, I'm really interested in this, but where do I fit in? And I think about that, and I go back to the local in terms of figure out what's happening in your community. But I also think that something has to resonate, and stories are a very powerful way to be able to make it real and make it tangible. So I think that's the counterpoint to all these statistics and these global issues that we hear about. It's like they're like albatrosses flying up high,
Okay, I have a question here. This is a question to all of the panelists. What big things are happening worldwide with respect to sustainability?
Well, this is hearkening back to the last panel in some ways, and several panels actually that I've either attended or been a part of. But one of the bigger things, and actually this is somewhat of a surprise to me, I didn't quite think of it this way before, is the use of cell phones throughout the world has become something really crucial to development, to issues of global poverty, and to sustainability. And not just the fact that everyone has a cell phone and can talk to their boyfriend, girlfriend, daughter, son, what may have, but the use of cell phones as an educational tool, even for people who may not have full literacy. There's been quite a bit of discussion during various panels throughout the week of how cell phone technology and apps are being directed towards giving new information to people who might not have ever had it before. And some of that is very crucial information, such as climate, what's the weather doing. If you're a farmer, that of course is very vital. But even on issues like how to treat water, or how to build a solar oven, for example. You can use cell phone technology these days to teach people how to do that. And education is so much a part of sustainability, is so much a part of poverty alleviation. And while I've been aware in Nicaragua of work like that that's been done, I really have heard a lot about it this week, and that's certainly something I think we want to explore, my wife and I, as part of the work we do in Nicaragua. And, so I think that's not the only answer or the single answer, but it's certainly an important one.
I think I would say, what big things are happening. We had a successful climate change conference in Paris last December, and we might not have done. We might not have done. I mean, it wasn't perfect, and I'm sure lots and lots of environmental campaigners, which I'm not, could kind of list the 20 ways in which the agreement at Paris fell short of what they wanted. But the fact is that by comparison with the 10 years before, and in particular with Copenhagen 5 years before, there was an agreement in Paris that got the major world powers, the United States, China, and others, to chart a path forward on recognizing planetary boundaries, particularly as it involves climate change. That's a big deal. It's a big deal. In New York last September, we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals. They're not perfect. Believe me, I can bore you for hours about how they're not perfect. I won't. But they're not perfect. But again, we got an international deal, which we might not have done. In July last year, much less noticed, in my view much more important, we had a conference in Addis Ababa to look at financing for development, which again might have been a kind of complete bust, and was not. The nations of the world came together with a kind of relatively straightforward and relatively sensible program for how development might be financed. I take great heart from that. I take great heart from those three meetings, because I think it's very, very easy to be cynical about international agreements. It's very, very easy to be cynical about the UN. I spent a day at the UN last week because they invited me up to chair a special meeting of the Economic and Social Committee, which is, a great honor for me, except, man, it was hard work, I tell you. It's very easy to be cynical about the United Nations. It's very cynical to be easy about international agreements. But the fact is, we've had 3 significant international agreements in 2015, and in each case we might not have done. In each case there might have been failure. So I take great heart from that, because I think that, the commitment, the international commitment to sustainable development is now grounded in kind of real life international agreements. As I said earlier, the important thing is to make sure those promises are kept, but we should not kind of diminish the extent to which, I know I'm talking at the high level, not at the kind of, at the micro level that you guys are so wonderfully talking about, but I think that high level matters.
Just kind of picking up very quickly on the notion of the climate change agreements, I think when we're looking at mitigation, that's a huge leap forward. I mean, one of the things that I've seen, there's been a real push for donors to look at issues of adaptation, especially adaptation for grassroots communities. And I just want to flag, I'm sure many of you follow climate change and understand the concept of mitigation versus adaptation, but it's often frustrating if you're working with low-income communities to have to kind of think about mitigation steps. I mean, we know that the use of firewood is a challenge, and I think the solar stoves has really been one of the biggest examples of mitigation for grassroots communities in terms of climate change, and has also been one of the more effective tools for gender. In fact, when you think about best practices, it's really the solar stoves that for many rural communities are the only spaces and places where we can talk about mitigation. I think the challenge, though, and that's what makes these agreements so exciting, is that when the governments and the governments that really pollute and the individuals who pollute are making commitments to lower emissions, that makes a huge difference in a development space. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had these discussions about, for most low-income people, it's about adapting. If you're a rural, small-scale farmer or you're in a coastal region, it's more about how are you going to survive as the climate is changing around you. It's not really, the mitigation is really hard to find, and you know, there isn't as much funding, quite frankly, for some of these adaptations. So I think you've got to have kind of both sides when you're talking about climate change interventions.
One of the big changes that I've noticed, well, there's two. There's food and there's green building, but I'll focus on green building. I've been involved in green building education for the last 15 plus years, and I remember the first U.S. Green Building Conference in Austin, one of the first ones. Maybe there were 1,500 people who attended. The latest ones get over 30,000 people that go. And they have been able to establish a lead, it's a standard for green building that has completely transformed the industry. Now, there's still a long way to go in terms of the number of buildings that are LEED certified, but if you consider the changes in the consciousness in terms of looking at the building features, the energy, the water, the materials used, the site remediation, all of this stuff is completely shifted, and that is really, really impressive, particularly as it relates to greenhouse gases. And now there's other standards, the Living Building Challenge, which takes it to a whole nother level, which is another standard that is also in the US and worldwide. Lenses is another set of standard framework and guidelines for that. So there's been a complete shift in the whole building industry, and thank God, because it has a huge impact in resources and greenhouse gases.
The next question has to do with overpopulation, which is something that we haven't discussed a lot on this panel, and the fact that there's 9 billion people on the earth, and drinking water.
Not yet.
Not quite yet, okay. Drinking water supply for humanity. I guess that there are a number of people asking about sustainability and overpopulation. So what will we look like in 50 years? It's kind of a two-part question. And then who's doing anything right in this arena of overpopulation, concerns around overpopulation?
I just keep, the thing that immediately pops in my mind is that, I think it's a book that overpopulation is everyone's baby, right? That, remember this probably, what was it, 30 years ago now? Or it's been around for a long time. I mean, I think what we've seen in terms of overpopulation is that when you have gender empowerment in particular, fertility rates tend to go down. So I think, you know, there are concerns about overpopulation. I think there's some discussion around rapid urbanization. What does it mean when you have high concentrations of people in just a few cities in a country? There's been a lot of discussion around sustainable cities and how can we create more opportunities in medium-sized cities, particularly with internet and technology, where you know, everyone doesn't necessarily need to be in the capital city. You can be in a secondary city that's thriving, where you have higher quality of life, fewer traffic jams, better air quality, and still be able to make a living and live in a way that's more sustainable. So I would have to say that I think overpopulation is something that we've traditionally been concerned about in the field, but I think what the numbers are demonstrating is that fertility rates are going down in many parts of the world, and that kind of goes hand in hand also with gender empowerment. That as women become more empowered, they tend to take more control over their fertility, and we see that overpopulation, you know, becomes less of an issue. There was a part of that question that mentioned water, and I think water is something that for us, you know, is a concern, but that has a lot to do with climate change and drought, not necessarily population pressures, but really, you know, lack of rainfall and kind of shifting climate patterns within certain regions. And I think that's a much more complex story. And I think that means that people may need to move from different areas. And it's something that you don't just see in the developing world. I mean, we're seeing a lot of it in the West, places like Nevada. I mean, how are we controlling water? How are we thinking sustainably for the long term about water, I think it's just becoming an issue. And if you look at the U.S. military, there's actually some analysis that's come out in the last few years looking at water as being a major resource challenge that could actually become a security threat over time in many regions of the world.
I completely agree on the centrality of gender empowerment in overpopulation. Those of you who are at the last session, I sort of have kind of 5 things that I always talk about in terms of tackling poverty, and one of them is empower women and girls. One of them is kind of look through a gender lens whenever you possibly can. I mean, it's the best investment that you can make in any sort of development, but particularly when one kind of looks at population stresses. I think, you know, as women have become more empowered, as they've had less children, as they spaced their children in a much more safe way, so one's seeing fertility rates come down. And the critical areas in the world now, in terms of unsustainably high fertility rates, are precisely those places where women are not empowered: the Sahel, countries like Niger, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso. There's a whole kind of swathe of countries across what I call the 520 band in Africa, between between latitude 5 and 20 north. But where one sees gender empowerment, then one sees fertility rates kind of come down pretty quickly. But the other point mentioned, which is critical, I think, is better get used to big cities. Better get used to big cities. I mean, like really big cities, you know. I mean, 17, 20 million, 25 million big cities, because in addition to population growth, we're also in the midst of, right now, in the middle of the kind of greatest movement that humanity has ever seen from rural areas to urban areas. Never seen anything like it before. And those of us who spend time in China, you know, you can almost watch cities grow, almost literally watch cities grow. So one of the consequences of the population question is, yes, gender empowerment really does have an impact, but for the next 30 or 40 years, better get used to big cities, because a lot of us are going to be living in them and a lot of us are going to be visiting them.
He's going to be back in a second, but did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think those are good responses, yeah. I mean, just so we get to other questions.
Yeah.
This next question is, what ways do you imagine will sensitize the first world to feel the realities of our being nature and the reality of global warming?
Well, I mean, I think travel, of course, but I mean, not travel in the sense of being a tourist, although, you know, being a tourist is not a bad thing, but finding out something about the wider world and how other people live. In our country in particular, Nicaragua, we often have delegations, or we often have volunteers, one of them sitting right over there, who came down and helped us build a shower on our property recently. But we've often had volunteers from other parts of the world, Switzerland, United States, Germany, come and work with us and sort of try to see the world through other eyes. And that's both the natural world and the world of people who live as people live in Nicaragua. You know, Nicaragua has a middle class, it has an upper class like any country. But by and large, the people that we work with and the people that we interact with most live completely different from the way that we live here in the United States, and they can't take for granted things that we take for granted. Potable water, for example. I mean, we walk out the door here and there's a water fountain. We go to the bathroom here, there's a flush toilet that is good for hygiene as well. All of these are things that it's easy to say there's a difference between here and there, but when you experience it firsthand, I think that really has a significant effect on how you will live your own life when you come back here, or whether you continue to work in countries such as that. So firsthand experience of the natural world and of the developing world to me is very important, whether it be Nicaragua, whether it be Bangladesh, whether it be somewhere else in the world. Get out there and see for yourself how other people live, not just how you live in this neighborhood.
I think, I mean, it sounds a little bit cliche, but kind of think global and act local, right? I mean, and I think particularly for young people, I'm more and more amazed with social networking, how easy it is for people to connect with other individuals in other parts of the world that are interested in the topics that you may be interested in. I mean, and I think that that's a way of kind of engaging and having a deeper conversation. When we're talking about sustainability, and particularly around issues of climate change, I mean, I know for me, and I keep kind of repeating this like a broken record, but part of the reason I wear my glasses so much is that I've basically had allergy issues in Washington since almost December, because we had temperatures in the 70s on December 23rd, and we actually had a lot of blooming plants. We've essentially had 2 growing cycles in Washington. And if you think about that, I mean, that's something that I remember being fascinated about learning in Latin America 15 years ago. And the climate change is happening so quickly that here we are with, you know, blooming plants on December 23rd. We were in shorts and a t-shirt. I had air conditioning on driving from Washington, D.C. to Southern Virginia, again for, you know, for the Christmas holidays, which I've never seen before in my life. And I think if we're seeing those impacts here in the north, you can imagine what those changes of a couple of degrees are doing in the global south, particularly in the agriculture field. I mean, many of these changes are already here. Large-scale agriculture, particularly, you know, in places like Latin America, no one really wants to own land because you're not really sure what you might be able to produce on it in the long term. So we're going back to kind of agricultural schemes where companies are providing all the inputs for the agricultural products because they don't want to invest in the land because it may not produce what it's producing now in 5 years because the climate is changing so rapidly. I've learned here in Boulder, I remember 4 or 5 years ago, I was on a climate change panel with some brilliant scientists here that were participating in the conference, and they were talking about how within their circles they make real estate decisions based on climate patterns and mapping that they're getting from their labs in the office, and really recommending to other colleagues and other scientists not to purchase land in certain parts of the United States. So I think if we're not kind of thinking globally, we're really blinding ourselves to the consequences, and they're coming here. And I think, you know, they've probably affected the global south even more strongly, but I mean, it's affecting us here in the United States as well.
I would add that in terms of being nature, connection to nature, it's biophilia. It's really an emotional connection to nature, because if we care about what's going on, then we're more likely to act. The facts, the figures, you know, we can learn about them until we're blue in the face, but the minute it has a resonance in ourselves, then we're going to move forward on that. Climate change is very, very tricky because it's such, the feedback loops are so long, and it's how do we connect to that. I was just thinking, it's interesting how glaciers are so visible in terms of retreating, that it's often used in terms of understanding climate change, and it's very hard to find others that are so physical. You know, studies that have been done in terms of trying to shock people into action by showing the polar bears about to drown. People won't feel like they want to spring into action, but it's very short-lived. It doesn't last a long term. If we instead create a plan where this is something you can do for the long run, it tends to be much more productive. I also think I agree with Judith in terms of the local. It's a connection of the local to the global. Global is a term that's been used for that. And it's understanding the story of our communities. It's understanding where our water comes from, where the garbage goes, what the watershed is, what the food shed is. You know, they did a study in Willits in Northern California years ago. They said, okay, what happens if the truck that comes in and delivers the food at our Safeway store, what happens if it doesn't show up for a week? How long can we last as a small community? And they kind of did this whole study to figure out how can we become more self-sufficient, how can we begin to grow our food, understand where our water, our energy, all of it. So I think understanding the story of place, the history of it, where our resources come from, is the first step to begin to connect with how the global impacts the local.
This actually ties a little into this last conversation. This is a student question, and it's a question for Judith, but Jose, you might also have something to say as well to it. Judith spoke about intrinsic value of nature. How can we communicate that and the severity of human impact to those that aren't directly affected by nature?
It's a really good question, and I think part of it is some of the ways that we do modeling and some of the ways we think about these questions. One of the challenges in development when you're working with local communities is that you need to think about consultation processes and really engaging local communities when you're talking about development. Now, one of the challenges is that if you tell a community, you're going to put some wind turbines here in your community, and the community doesn't even know what a wind turbine really is, and you've got a small scale model and you kind of demonstrate it. What can happen is that once that construction starts, people say, my God, this thing is huge and it's making this noise, and what about the birds? And I think that, one of the things that we don't always do, and it sounds a little bit cliche, but I think sometimes seeing what these projects actually look like would make a huge impact. I know it's very common in the development world in general for folks to do desk reviews of very, very large-scale operations with very limited information, perhaps with a couple of pictures, which are pretty easy to get with satellite imaging and on-the-ground consultants, but not really getting in the physical space to understand what the potential implications might be. So if you're kind of designing everything from afar, it doesn't become clear. And if you're in the community and you're there and you might be impacted by some of these discussions or some of these decisions, if you've never seen what a port looks like, what a large-scale port might look like, or a wind turbine, it's very difficult for you to opine on it or make any sort of decisions because you don't have adequate information. So again, I think it's the kind of basic challenge of economics, right? We assume that everyone has kind of access to perfect information, and that's very rarely the case. So I would say you've got to get into the space, you've got to get into the environment to understand the value of it. And to understand how people use it and how it's perceived as an asset. That's why I'm so excited by the prospects of biodiversity, because I think if we value biodiversity and we actually make investments in biodiversity and conservation, where we're leveraging some of those riches and resources that are preserved in the natural world, and we can learn to quantify them a little bit better, I think we might be able to learn how to conserve them a little bit better as well.
Ecosystem services is a field that's been growing, and there's definitely controversy in terms of putting a dollar figure on biodiversity and then trading it, but it's having an impact in terms of mitigation. But I go back to understanding what is keeping us alive, how we're part of the pollinators, how we're part of the rivers and all of the services that nature does, which then in turn has an impact on the commons. The commons meaning that what we all rely on the air and the water and the healthy soils and the food and all of that. And how do we begin to understand that we're not going to last a whole lot longer if all of those systems are in decline or break up? I was thinking of the 73 oil embargo, which was such a radical thing. I still remember that. When there were lines for gas, we haven't had very many of those. When gas went up several years ago, people's driving patterns changed. But those are few and far between sort of massive national shifts that have happened. In other countries, you can drive in on certain days depending on the license plate because of the pollution, right, when it's really bad. London changing the commuting thing where it's cheaper if you do use mass market. These are sort of changes that are happening at the economic level to try and shift behavior. One of the fields I'm really fascinated about is conservation psychology, which is really looking at our behavior and how to shift behavior, because as we know, just facts and figures don't do it. We have to understand what motivates us as humans in terms of trying to shift habits and behaviors that are for the greater good.
This is a question for everyone. This is one I would be so curious to hear what your response is going to be. What are two things each of us can do to make a difference in human impact on the environment?
Silence.
It's a stumper.
I think.
Well,
No, you go ahead.
Well, I can think of one right away. Is definitely a car driving. You know, the impact of that and mass transit. That's a huge one in terms of greenhouse gases. A second one, you know, maybe it's a combination of a bunch of habits that we live in terms of temperature, waste, all of these things, and how we can change a little habit. I was thinking of the grocery bags in California. How do we begin to shift that habit of actually bringing our own bags to the grocery store? And you know, at first it's really hard, and you forget it, and then pretty soon afterwards you just do it by habit. And that's that shift that needs to happen. And once it happens, then it's the norm. But how do we make that on all those little decisions that we make every day? So I think that's a route towards that.
I think this question about learning the end use, I remember years ago, I actually had an opportunity to work with an automobile manufacturing company that decided to use natural coconut fibers and natural latex, because in Europe, when you manufacture a large-scale vehicle, you have to look at what happens in the beginning of the process and the end use. So how do you recycle the vehicle at the end? And for them, it was worthwhile to invest resources in making their headrests, their seat cushions, their side panels out of this natural latex and coconut fiber, because it increased their recycled content of these, you know, very large-scale trucks, which, you know, trucks out of coconut fiber and natural latex. But I mean, it was worth it for them to go into the Amazon and really explore this area and to create some interesting sustainable value chains with local communities to do that. The other thing that I find always so ironic is that when we're thinking about being sustainable, that we have to often put our consumerism aside. I can't tell you how many products are being sold, and it's like, okay, well, I've got, you know, I've got the even more green thermos now, and I've got the even more green grocery bag. But did you have 25 other bags that could have been useful in your garage or in your closet? What are you going to do with all of these things? And I think there is a real tendency to look for the sexy and the green. And I hear some of that conversation as well around sustainability circles of kind of like poo-pooing people who are actually reusing and opting and kind of putting pressure to buy the latest, greatest gadget. And I think that's something very, quite frankly, very American. When you talk to conservation movements in other parts of the world that are grassroots, you often see kind of more emphasis on the reusing. And some of that is just a condition of poverty, right? So when a building goes down in Latin America, I mean, it's stripped. There's somebody in there taking every little thing, and you look at how we, you know, demolish buildings here in the United States, it looks like some of them still have furniture in them. You know, they certainly have all the blinds, you know, no one's kind of, so this idea of, you know, not looking for the new, not being consumeristic about being green, and really thinking about all of the waste and the buildup of just stuff that we have, part of being green is also purging and getting rid of a lot of this stuff, not just going out and buying new things. Thank you.
Going back to a point that Judith was making a little bit earlier, I guess that I would reiterate that for me, something that you can do is be more open to hearing how other people have to live within the world. She was talking a little bit about how important it is to consult with communities and to essentially take in the advice, the way that people live in other parts of the world. In particular for us, places like Central America, where we've worked. If you're not able to sort of see the world through other people's eyes or take into account how they see their community, then I don't think you're going to be very effective as a development worker, and you're not really addressing issues of sustainability if you're just saying, take my solution because it's the right one, rather than listening to why they might not be interested in your solution or why your solution might not really be the correct one for that community. And that's a process of opening yourself, but it's also a process of really learning about how can I speak to an audience that I may, at this point in my life, have nothing in common with. You know, there's a lot of tools and techniques for that, but I think it's important, first of all, to consider who your audience is at all times when you're looking to address these kinds of issues, and where you know, what are the best way to get from point A to point B. If you can have anything in your toolbox that opens people up to being able to talk about what the real problems are within their lives, not just the physical problems of water or hygiene, but what, other issues they may face. If you can find a way to do that as an outsider or as an insider, my wife often does this as an insider, as a Nicaraguan working with other Nicaraguan women, but it's not the kind of society where she can just walk in and say, well, tell me all your problems and I'll try to help you solve them. There's more involved than that. If you open up your eyes and your ways of dealing with people who may not be exactly like you, whether it's here or whether it's Nicaragua or whether it's Mongolia, I think that's an important way to get at this.
This actually came in from two students, and suggestions as to how students can get involved in global, specifically alleviation of global poverty.
There's our chapter of the One campaign on the CU campus with two distinguished members sitting in front. They can join that.
Do they want to raise their hands? Where are they? Right here?
There you go. Go see them.
I've been on several panels with the fellow that's doing a lot of the work with Peace Corps here, and he's probably going to recommend joining the Peace Corps. That is a 2-year commitment. Some people can and some people can't. I hope many students can make that sort of commitment. But even at a lesser level, I mean, I think there are hundreds of good organizations, thousands of good organizations that offer ways in which to do that. It's recommended, highly recommended, to do your research as to whether those are organizations that are truly doing what they're saying they're doing, and so sort of go through a vetting process to pick them out. Peace Corps, I can speak as a former Peace Corps volunteer, does a pretty good job both vetting its volunteers and usually, not always, but usually placing them in positions where they can really contribute to communities where they work. And if you have the time that you can commit to that, not just, and you don't need to be a student to join the Peace Corps, you can certainly join at any time in your life. That's one recommendation. But again, looking around, there are a lot of different organizations, my wife's organization being one, that takes short-term volunteers, or you can join delegations that often can contribute in very vital ways to what we're speaking of.
I have a degree in what's called income distribution and poverty alleviation, and I think one of the things that my career path in terms of international development may be a little bit different than others. I actually started out doing a lot of poverty alleviation work here in the United States, and I think that travel is very important. I think the international experiences are very important, but I would encourage you to take a look and see what's happening in places here in Boulder, and even going to places in Denver to see how poverty is lived in the United States. I think it will give you a policy perspective. There are certain safety nets that we have in the United States, but there are also certain limitations in terms of how entrepreneurial people can be, and we maybe don't have access to all of the informal sector mechanisms that you sometimes see in developing countries. And I would also agree that kind of combining that with perhaps a more international experience, even if it's a summer or if it's a semester, it will give you a window on the world. But I don't think, and sometimes I've been asked this in the past, well, is poverty much worse in the developing world as it is in the United States? And I can tell you, I worked when I was in college in a place in Chicago that no longer exists. It's called Cabrini Green, and I can tell you some of the poverty that I saw in Cabrini Green is extraordinarily shocking, and in many ways just as shocking as some of the poverty that I've seen in places like Brazil with the waste pickers up in Recife or in Porto Alegre or Rio. So again, I think poverty is often about systems. It's about understanding systems and seeing how it works in your own country and close to home will give you a perspective that I think may actually be an advantage over the long haul if you really do want to work in sustainable development. Often these are systemic issues of exclusion and marginalization.
This might be our last question, but we're going to see how long we take to answer it. It's also from a student. How will the advances of technology help with the eradication of poverty?
We had this question in the last session, and there's already been comments about the mobile phone, which I genuinely think, its significance cannot be overstated. I mean, I think it's not just the connectedness that mobile phones gives people, although that's liberating, particularly for women. But it's also that, you pack an enormous amount of technology into that little device. Increasingly, it's a medical device. We're going to be able to kind of do sensors so that you're going to be able to kind of self-diagnose illnesses remarkably quickly. It's a communication device, it's a learning device, it's an educational device, and it's a sharing device. It's a way in which communities can come together, and it's a way in which communities can connect with people who have the similar sorts of challenges and problems in other parts of the world. I think, you know, one of the things that we've learned over the last, I was talking to a friend of mine who's a very, very distinguished management consultant based in South Africa. He's Kenyan. And I was having lunch with him a few months ago. And I was sort of deliberately being provocative and said, you know, James, you know, don't you think that it's possible to overstate the significance of the mobile phone revolution in development in Africa? And he put down his knife and fork. He said, it is completely impossible. It is completely impossible to overstate the significance of the mobile phone as a development revolutionary device. I mean, he was really, really, one of the examples that he gave is that just think how hard it is now to do old-fashioned ballot stuffing as a way of stealing an election. I mean, there are plenty of ways you can steal an election, plenty of ways you can be corrupt, but you can't actually any longer, you know, put 500 kind of freshly marked ballots into a ballot box, because someone will be taking a photograph. You know, because every polling station will have someone, you know, with 10 mobile phones just kind of taking photographs the whole time. Doesn't mean that every election is free and fair, but it does mean that, you know, certain things that were possible just a few years ago are now not possible, and certain things that were impossible now are.
I would just say also the democratization of information. I mean, I fully agree with the importance of technology and cell phone technology in particular. But if you look at, you know, these massive online courses, if you look at how much information is available, that if someone, you know, is truly interested, curious, and has talent, they can access almost, you know, anything, any type of information that they would be interested in finding, which I think is extremely powerful from the point of view of sustainability. It means that we can find sustainable solutions in other parts of the world, and as we know, you know, necessity is the mother of invention. So if you yourself are in a condition where you need to find a creative solution, you're more likely to do that in the context of using some of this technology. It just reminds me a little bit also of an experience in India, where they use cell phone technology to match people up for job opportunities, and as more and more low-income communities are able to use place and space and broker and leverage their own internal resources. So instead of going outside of the community, you can see if there are resources within your community that you can leverage or use, whether that means, you know, small scale employment jobs, opportunities to do like job sharing, or providing caring services like child care and things like that in a collective way. So I think it opens up to networks information at all different levels, whether it's, you know, high level academic information or information about resources that may be just around the corner that you can't access, you know, you haven't been able to access up until now.
Just to add to that, I think there's also the shift to local empowerment. And in my research of nonprofits that are working, how do we begin to empower the local people in their own villages? There's a program, Digital Green, that was started by Microsoft years ago, and now they spun off on their own, where they have the local farmers become the stars of the village, and they're trained, and then they train other farmers, and so it becomes like a home ownership where they really take ownership of these new skills, and they become the stars that then teach others. Similarly, in safe water and promoting safe water, Blue Planet Network is working in having the regional villages then decide which next village they want to target and work with to provide safe drinking water, whereas the headquarters may be in the US, but again, they're seeing how the local and regional leaders can decide what the next step is, and then they get the support from the headquarters.
Yeah, I would reiterate that, yes, local is one way to go, but also having examples like that where people are able to communicate with each other about the kind of things that we're working on. For example, sorry, to take an example, my wife's work in sustainable agriculture, we're really working with a methodology that is a soil improvement methodology called the biointensive method. You're not really trying to grow things, you're trying to grow soil, and then you can grow things within that soil. But what she's often found with that as part of her work, or with the solar ovens, is that people communicating with each other within a community, if one person sees, a family that has 10 garden beds growing a diversified series of crops so that they're not just eating rice and beans, they want to find out how that family was successful at doing that. If they see a solar oven, they may approach your organization about how do I get one of those solar ovens. If they learn about the technique for cleaning water, SOTUS, that is focused on within her group for using UV rays to purify water, that's communication. I mean, one of the reasons that I talked a little bit about, or we've all talked a little bit about cell phones in terms of this kinds of technology dispersing this information, is cell phones are so ubiquitous throughout the world. When I first went to Nicaragua 16 years ago, no one had a cell phone, and I remember at times we had accidents on site when I was building drinking water systems, or just accidents with the community where we had no way to call an ambulance. The nearest landline was miles away. There was nothing you could do to other than try to carry the person down the hillside, or if it was a child that was hurt within the village, put them in your arms, or sometimes put them on the back of a bicycle and bike them down to the road. Now with cell phones, that kind of thing has changed. So, I mean, cell phones, it's not a be-all, end-all of everything, but that kind of technology becoming more ubiquitous and more in the hands of people who otherwise don't have access to the sorts of information technology that we have here is what will, I think, help a lot with education and sustainability developments within the next 10, 15, 20 years. And not just cell phones. Hopefully there will be other advances that will be able to reach the audience of people who really need them, both here within the United States and outside the United States. But those are the kinds of things that I think technology can do a really good job of, as long as it's ultimately geared towards people who might really need it, as well as those of us who have easy access to it.
Thank you all. There are two students pointing to them back here. They're with the One campaign. Mercedes is up here as well to speak about her work in Nicaragua. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and supporting Conference of World Affairs. Thank you very much.